Hello, Stratters. It's CreepEvee, and I am back. Yes, I am not dead. I'm glad to be back. It's been a while. Definitely been a while. A few months. Several months, actually, since I've made a video for the channel. Um, I'm not going to get, like, super into it, but it was a combination of some health problems and some, not really having the motivation, so I needed some time off, and it's been good to take a little bit of a break. And I'm looking to get back into making videos. Of course, I love making videos for you guys, and I do apologize for not being around making content. But now that I'm back and I had that break, I think it's going to be for the better, and I think it's going to allow me to produce better content now that I've taken some time to get settled in. I moved to my new place, and got pretty well settled in with my new job. So I think that I'm now at a position where I can get back into making videos, and I'm excited to. So with this deck we're going to be looking at, I'm excited because this is actually my latest paper deck. So this is what I'm playing for Pauper in local tournaments now, which are finally starting to pick up in my area, which is awesome. But so we're playing Pauper Affinity, and I'm just going to do a deck tech for right now, but we are going to play some games with this deck because it's so fun to play, and it's honestly solid. Like, I'm not going to say it's super competitive, but it has some really solid matchups, and that's what I like. Is there aren't that many, like, Pauper is a format that does kind of break down into, like, certain decks just win against other decks and lose against certain decks, and I don't like that. Like, I think Pauper's a good format besides that aspect of it, um, and Affinity is just really, like, middle of the line. Doesn't have too many, like, super great matchups, but it doesn't really have any bad matchups. It does get hurt by the side deck sometimes, so we'll go over that. But I think I know enough about this deck to talk about it. I actually, let me see if I still have it pulled up. But I do have a primer that I wrote on Tapped Out for it. If you guys want to check it out, I'll have the link in the description. My Atog's Cheat Day, yeah, because I'm clever. But that'll just give you kind of a description. I go down the individual card choices, but I'm pretty much going to cover the same thing in this video. But let's just get into it. I've rambled enough. So Pauper Affinity is actually utilizes the real affinity mechanic. Remember that before Modern Affinity ditched every card that actually had affinity in it? Yep, this is how Mirrodin first ruined Standard, and then it only got better from there once Arcbound Ravager got printed. And now at this point in Modern, you don't even need the affinity cards. There's so many other things for you to kill off with Arcbound Ravager. But we don't have Arcbound Ravager in this format, so what are we going to sacrifice our artifacts to make big? We're going to do that with Atog. Yep, Atogs. These little guys, they're some of my favorite creatures in Magic, so getting to use one of them is pretty fun. Plus, I just love the artwork for these guys. They're super cool. But Atog, he is a 2-drop red creature. You sacrifice an artifact, he gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Very simple stuff. So he is going to be our main engine of the deck. He's not the only way to win with this deck, but he is pretty much the way that we're going to go with things. And in general, we're going to fling him. We play 2 copies of Fling. I hate this artwork for Fling, but it's what we've got. And then also we play 1 Temur Battle Rage. That way we can win by combat if we have to. But generally we want to go for Fling, just because going into combat makes things more complicated, and we take bigger risks. We want to just be able to deal with as little risk as possible. So first of all, let's just go down the artifacts that accompany Atog, since they're going to be what we're sacrificing to him. And one thing that Modern doesn't have that Pauper does is the full cycle of artifact lands. there's a reason these guys are banned in Modern, and you will soon see if you're not familiar with these guys. Darksteel Citadel is legal in Modern, but the rest are not. So the artifact lands are just what they are. They're artifacts as well as lands. And they tap for respective colors, and then Darksteel Citadel is colorless, but it benefits from being indestructible. So the reason why these guys are not legal in Modern is because Affinity is a thing. It would be ridiculously strong. There are other decks that would benefit from it, but Affinity would utterly dominate the format. Just as if they need one more thing to make it good, even though it's not quite as bad as it used to be. But so these guys double as being our land producers, as well as being food for our Atog, as well as they trigger Metalcraft for a few of our cards that we'll get into in just a second. So there's just no downside to these guys, no need to play basic lands for this deck. We're just going to be playing 4 of the red, blue, green, and then the Darksteel Citadel we're playing 4 of. You're going to notice a pattern in this deck is that it's mostly 4-ofs with a few tech choices here and there, and I'll kind of point those out whenever we get to them. Then Prophetic Prisms, one of Pauper's favorite cards. We're playing 4 of those. Just a 2-drop artifact that gives us a free draw as well as some mana filtration, which, you know, always good. 4 copies of Springleaf Drum, because we are going for the essence of Affinity, where we play creatures that are basically free to play, and then we can tap them for mana, so we're just netting pluses off of it. 1 Flare Husk. I only play 1. A lot of people like to play 3 to 4. I honestly just don't think it's that great. Getting a creature out of it is pretty nice, but ultimately, to me, it is a 1-drop artifact that we can sacrifice. Only in very desperate situations do you find me equipping it to creatures. But it does have Living Weapon, which is one of my favorite mechanics. But that really doesn't, you know, come into play. Really, it's just a good, balanced 1-drop artifact. But doesn't give us the added bonus that the rest of our artifacts do, so I'm fine with it just being at 1. The only reason why I really even play the 1, besides the fact that it can be a like last minute blocker, is because it does interact with Springleaf Drum, because it's a living weapon, so you get the token whenever it comes in that can now be tapped with Springleaf Drum for mana. Because Springleaf Drum does not care about your creature having haste, it does the tapping for it, so they can do it on the turn that they enter. Chromatic Star, probably the best artifact in the deck, and also the one reason why this deck is actually a little bit pricey, just because you're playing 4 of these guys. The reason why these are so good is because they draw a card whenever they go into grave. If you've ever wondered why Chromatic Star is way more expensive than Chromatic Sphere, which is a question a lot of newer players have, I remember having that question myself, and it really just comes down to the wording of the card. Chromatic Sphere says that you sacrifice it and get the mana of any color, and then you draw, whereas Chromatic Star has that same text, but it says when it goes into the graveyard. So it's separate, which means that if something does happen to it, you're still going to get a draw, whereas Sphere, you actually have to sack it for the mana to get that draw effect. And we're typically not going to sacrifice it in this deck unless we absolutely have to. But we are going to sacrifice it to Atog, and because it's Chromatic Star, not Chromatic Sphere, we will get to draw off of it. So, very great for our strategy. A 1-drop artifact that lets us draw a card. Kind of does the same thing as Prophetic Prism, but it's a 1-drop. Now, for our artifact creatures, which double as being creatures, as well as food for our Atog, and of course something to tap with Springleaf Drum, we have Mirror Enforcer as our big guy, and our little guy Frogmite, and so they have affinity for artifacts. For those of you who are only familiar with modern Affinity, Affinity was the reason, it's how the deck got its namesake, but basically it's just a deck that's been around since it was based off of the Affinity mechanic, so it's kept that name, even though it doesn't play any Affinity cards anymore. It's just a weird way that names have stayed around. So Affinity basically reduces casting cost based on whatever it has an affinity for. So I know that it's mostly for artifacts, but there are some that are like affinity for islands or affinity for forests. I think there was a full cycle of those. But Mirror Enforcer and Frogmite both have affinity for artifacts, and since they're colorless, as long as we've got enough artifacts, these guys will be free. Which is pretty awesome. Very easy to get Frogmite out on turn 2 for absolutely no mana, or even just 1, so awesome, awesome, awesome stuff. And Mirror Enforcer just serves as being a 4/4 that's also going to be free for us. You will notice this deck does have some pretty high damage creatures here, having a 4/4. Frogmite isn't bad at a 2/2. So they're awesome creatures. They get that interaction with Springleaf Drum, and we're also going to be able to eat them with our Atog. Now, for the rest of the creatures in the deck, we have Carapace Forger. Carapace Forger is like probably the second best creature in this deck, as far as actually being a creature and not just being something that we can eat with Atog or tap with Springleaf Drum. Not to say that these guys can't attack, because they definitely can, but Carapace Forger is just an amazing card. On its base, it's a bear. It's a 2/2 for 2. But with Metalcraft, it becomes a 2/2 for 4. Well, I mean, a 4/4 for 2, I should say. Which is absolutely incredible. And if you don't have Metalcraft in this deck, either you've just eaten all of your stuff with Atog, or you're not winning the game. And even if you're not, it's still a bear, which is a pretty solid thing to throw down. So I think that I've seen some decks try to get away with only running like 2 of these or cutting it completely. And my answer to that is just why. Like, this card is absolutely incredible, like, regardless. So if you're gonna have a creature in this deck to support Atog, I don't think you're gonna find much better than Carapace Forger. But we do have 2 of these guys, Gearseeker Serpents, and this is another card where I differ on some other people's choices. Some people like to run this thing at 4. I think that it's just way too expensive, and yes, it is going to reduce its cost because it doesn't have affinity, but it basically is an affinity effect. But I still think that it's too high of a cost, because you're still going to be paying 2 blue for it no matter what. We can't circumvent that casting cost. So I think that it's still going to be too high of a price, but it's hard to ignore this card being a 5/6 that we can give unblockable. It is the perfect way to back up our plan if our Atog plan fails, which is the argument that a lot of people make for it. But the way I look at it is, if your Atog plan has failed, it means that you've probably eaten up your artifacts with your Atog, and now you're trying to scramble to come up with a secondary plan, which seems like a good idea, because then you cast Gearseeker Serpent, but you've sacked off your artifact land and you've sacked off your other artifacts, which means that Gearseeker Serpent's casting cost is not really being circumvented. So that's why Carapace Forger really is your long-term plan. But Gearseeker Serpent is definitely a great backup plan, but you can't rely on it if your board state has already been completely destroyed by yourself. A lot of builds try to run just 1. I think it's good at 2, and it's something that you can side out in games 2 and 3 if you don't think that you need it. And as for the rest of our cards in this deck, we just have 2 Metallic Rebukes, because in this deck it's one of the best counter spells in the game. Has Improvise, so we can tap artifacts to pay the 2 colorless. which is pretty awesome because we've always got artifacts, and we do have blue land. So tap it and counter a spell unless your opponent pays 3, so it's not a straight counter spell, but typically this deck wants to win very early game, and that will definitely prevent your opponent from paying if it's super early. Then Thoughtcast, one of the biggest reasons why early versions of Affinity in Standard were ridiculous, because you're going to draw 2 for normally just 1 blue. So not quite Ancestral Recall, but you're getting there. So I mean, like, that's it. You have your draw power here with Thoughtcast, your Prophetic Prisms, and your Chromatic Stars. You're getting draw power. All of your creatures have synergy with Springleaf Drum, and of course Atog synergizes really well with pretty much all of your artifacts. The deck is just really wrapped tightly, which is why a lot of decks, the lists are pretty standard. It's a deck that's pretty well optimized, but there's definitely room to play with things and play it the way you want to play it. This is just my personal preference and what I've been testing for a while. Now let's jump over to the side deck, and I first want to start by talking about the 2 Gorilla Shaman, because Gorilla Shaman is the death of this deck. Now let's look at what Gorilla Shaman says for a second. First of all, it's a 1-drop for red, and it has 1 and then 2x. Destroy target non-creature artifact with converted mana cost X. Your lands are artifacts, and they are converted mana cost 0. So Goblin Shaman only has to pay 1 colorless to blow up a land. That is why Gorilla Shaman is sided in Pauper, because it completely destroys the land base of this deck. Gorilla Shaman is the worst thing that could possibly happen to this deck. It's a part of the reason why Galvanic Blast is so good, because you need some creature removal. Galvanic Blast, by the way, is in this deck because it's the best bolt spell in Pauper if you're playing artifact decks. So we play the Gorilla Shaman for the mirror matches, just because you can pretty much automatically win this game if you start out with Gorilla Shaman and resolve it. And then we play 2 copies of Kark Clan Shaman. We sacrifice an artifact, deal 1 damage to each creature without flying. Keep in mind that does count itself, so unless you're doing some shenanigans, your Shaman's going to die along with that. So it's typically just a 1-shot thing, but it synergizes well with it being an artifact deck. And if we sack off something like a Chromatic Star, then we're going to be able to get our plus off of it. So a lot of synergy there, and pretty solid as far as like small white weenies removals goes. And then we got Pyroblast. We play 3 of those because you are playing a combo deck and you need to be able to stop counter spells, as well as just deal with Delver decks in general because of how fast they can be. Accompanying that, we have the 2 Hydra Blasts to kind of deal with Blue-Red Delver, as well as burn matchups. And then we got 2 copies of Stone Rain because Tron is still one of the best decks in this format. Assassin's Trophy slowed it down in Modern, but it sure did not slow it down in Pauper, so we still have to keep it in mind. 2 Serene Hearts. Some people go back and forth on how they want to deal with Boggles matchups. We're not playing, what is that card called? Electricity, to deal with them before the enchantments come down, so we're having to deal with them after they come down. Serene Heart is a 2-drop that handles that. I prefer doing it this way because if your opponent has multiple enchantments in hand and they have 1 Boggle out, they target it with one of them, and then you kill it off with Electricity. Comes in, doesn't have a target, and it fizzles. The thing with Serene Heart is you can let that opponent just stack up all of the cards onto their 1 Boggle like they like to do, and then with 1 card you completely strip it down, and now that Boggle can't do anything to you. So that's the reason why I like Serene Heart more. It is still at instant speed and it's only a 2-drop. I think that more people should view this as the way to deal with boggles if you have green. But that's just my 2 cents on that. We're playing one Feed the Clan. This is your answer to Burn. This beats Burn. Like, it honestly does whenever you look at the math of the strength of burn spells in Pauper versus your total life starting at 20 and how many turns they have to go through with an average hand to burn you out of 30 life. If they're not playing like a creature based thing where they have repeated damage, dealing with 30 life in Pauper over the course of a few turns is just, you get completely outpaced. Now you might be saying, well, Dylan, we're only going to gain 5 life, but with Ferocious, which, let's just look over here, we have Atog who grows to be as big as we want him to be. Gear Seeker, Carapace Forger is normally a 4/4, Mirror Enforcer is a 4/4, so Ferocious is just not difficult for us to trigger. So this just completely beats out Burn as long as, you know, you're not getting awful luck. So that's the reason why we're only playing one. It's pretty standard for the side deck in this deck. You will just ruin a Burn player's day if you resolve one. And then lastly, we have Relic of Progenitus for our graveyard-based decks, but typically they're a little bit on the slower end, and this deck is very, very fast. So I'm not as worried about that in the matchups, which is why we're only playing one. So that's my list. I really love this deck. I've played it for a while and then finally just decided to build it in paper and been loving it ever since. This is just, it's a good middle ground deck to play. It's pretty simple to play once you get used to it. You just have to kind of get a pattern of when do you want to go off with your combo, because you can talk about combo decks that use up their resources. This deck eats its resources. You have to eat up everything with your Atog and then cast your Fling. You have to eat up everything and then cast your Battle Rage. If you mess up and go off too early and they stop you with this deck, you have nothing left. You just have to scoop. And so that is the biggest problem and the biggest weakness of this deck. But if you learn to play it smart and learn the right times to go off and when you need to rush yourself and when you don't, and learning the other decks in the format so that you know the matchups, this deck is pretty straightforward to play. It's a little bit intimidating at first because, you know, finding that right timing is a little bit difficult, but once you do that and you get a good idea of the metagame and what decks you're playing against, you should have no problem playing this deck. And like I said, it's budget friendly outside of the Chromatic Stars, but I think they're even starting to go down because of Assassin's Trophy getting printed. And then of course the Pyroblast and Hydroblast, but if you're going to play Pauper, you pretty much need to invest in them for your side decks. So that's the deck. I absolutely love it. I'm sure you will too. So if you try it out, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear you guys' experience with the deck. I will plan on getting some videos, at least one video up of a few games with this deck because I'm very eager to play it. Let me know whether you guys want to get in on that, because I will try to post on my Facebook page whenever I am playing for videos. That way you guys can join in. Feel free to add me on MTGO. It's just CreepEvee, just like my username. And if you like the video, please do express that feeling with the like button. We do appreciate it. And let me know in the comments what you guys want to see next. I'd love to make some more videos for you guys in Pauper and maybe some other formats. But other than that, it's glad to be back. Feels nice. So I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.